Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our mini-series of shiurim on how the clock impacted Tefilah. Impacted not only Tefilah, but a lot of Torah Judaism. Before I begin the material, let me make some introductory remarks. If you want to ask a question during the shiur, feel free to type your question on chat. I will see your question and incorporate the answer into the ongoing shiur. If you're watching this shiur from the archives and you want to ask a question, feel free to send me an email inquiry here on chat. You have my email address. And I don't look at email every day, but within a few days I'll notice your email and respond to a question that you might have on chat, on email. But if you want to ask a question about an archived shiur, just make sure you mention which shiur exactly it is you're asking about. Then I'll understand the context of your question, and I'll be able to respond to it. That's introductory material. Now let's begin with the stuff itself. Before looking at the sources, we have to have a basic understanding of what it is we're going to be doing in these shiurim. First, we're going to have to see the situation that existed before people had clocks. Well, I know that clocks existed since antiquity. I'm talking about ordinary people having clocks in their homes. You know, just because there was a clock, a sundial somewhere in town, doesn't mean everyone had a clock. I'm talking about up till the 17th century, when more or less no one had a clock, and then from the 17th century on, when clocks became very popular, very common, became ordinary household items. We're going to have to see the structure of the Jewish community before clocks. That's what we're going to do first. And then we'll see the changes which occurred after the clocks were introduced. I'm going to choose one specific halacha to look at. When we look at one specific halacha, you'll understand the mechanisms by which the clock impacted on Jewish life. And once you have the idea with respect to this one halacha, you'll be able to expand and multiply examples endlessly yourself. Let's begin with Ma'ariv Bizmano, the correct time to daven Ma'ariv, the evening prayer. Now, the correct time to daven the evening prayer turns out to be a little bit controversial. Well, even more than the question of the time for the evening prayer, whether or not you have to pray at all in the evening is itself not so clear. After all, according to the Gemara, Shacharit, the morning prayer, Mincha, the afternoon prayer, are obligatory. According to the Gemara, Ma'ariv or Arvit, two names for the same thing, Ma'ariv or Arvit. Ashkenaz communities usually call the evening prayer Ma'ariv. Sephardic communities usually call it Arvit, but it's two names for the same thing. According to the Gemara, Ma'ariv or Arvit is Reshut. Let's get that spelled correctly on chat. Is Reshut optional? Optional tefillah. In the course of time, and this is a subject for a different series of classes to understand what happened and why it happened, but in the course of time, this optional prayer, the third prayer, became mandatory. But I'm not going to get into the reasons for that at this point. Now, the correct time for Ma'ariv, let's get the first source actually on the screen. I choose the Rambam as the typical example of great rabbis who formulated the correct timing for Ma'ariv, the evening prayer. I chose the Rambam, but the list could be made very, very long of rabbis who say the same thing, maybe in different words, with slightly different terminology. But the following is the basic idea, which is appearing over and over again in all of the rabbinical writings back in the days when people did not have clocks at home. Lefi shetfilat arvit reshut. Since the evening prayer is optional, and indeed it used to be optional, whether it still is today is a subject for another discussion, but since the evening prayer is optional, reshut, ein medaktekin bizmana, you need not be precise in timing it. We don't need any precise timing for Ma'ariv. Unlike Shacharit and Mincha, which have very precise time designations, the earliest and the latest when the prayer can be done, Ma'ariv is not so precise. Bilvad sheyikra kriyat shma bizmana. The one thing which must be done punctually, according to the correct timing, is kriyat shma. After all, Ma'ariv, the evening prayer, consists basically of two parts. First, there's Shema Yisrael, with its Braghot before and after, and then there's the Amidah, the Shmona Esrei, the Tefilah, where you stand quietly with your feet together. Those are two different mitzvot which have been combined together. The first is the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. The second is the mitzvah of Tefilah. Kriyat Shema, there you must be very careful about the timing. And Kriyat Shema must be recited at its correct time. Ma'ariv, before, after, it really doesn't matter. The correct time for Kriyat Shema, for Shema Yisrael, is Achar Tzeit Kochavim, after the appearance of the stars. The earliest time for the mitzvah of Shema Yisrael is the appearance of the stars, dark. The latest time, he mentions when he's talking about Kriyat Shema, the latest time is midnight, and exactly within those borders, the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema should be done. Now, if one prays the evening prayer before the appearance of the stars, so the Tefilah is fine, the Shmona Esrei is fine, the Amidah is fine, the prayer part is fine. The Kriyat Shema component, on the other hand, is invalid because it's not yet Tzeit Kochavim. The stars have not yet appeared, and therefore anyone who davens the evening prayer before the appearance of the stars is going to have to repeat the 3 paragraphs of Shema Yisrael later in the evening, sometime after the appearance of the stars and before midnight. Now, let me make one important comment here. There's an idea which has just sort of slipped by here without very careful examination. How do you know the precise times of the day? Certain halachas depend upon times of the day which are simply observable. For example, Hanetzach Hama, let's get that spelled correctly on chat. Hanetzach Hama, sunrise, assuming that it's not a cloudy day, and assuming that your view of the horizon is unobstructed, assuming there are no buildings or nothing in the way between you and the horizon, you can observe the precise moment of Hanetzach Hama. You can observe the precise moment of sunrise, the very moment that the first spark of the disk of the sun, when the top of the disk of the sun makes its first appearance over the horizon, that's the precise moment of sunrise. It's a simply observable phenomenon, assuming that it's not cloudy, assuming that you have unobstructed view of the horizon. Same thing about Shkia. Sunset is similarly an observable phenomenon, assuming that you can see the western horizon unobstructed. The moment the sun totally disappears beneath the horizon and no part of the sun is visible anymore, that's the precise moment of Shkia. These are precisely observable phenomena. Similarly, Chatzot. There you got it spelled correctly on chat. Chatzot, midday, the middle of the day, is also an observable phenomenon. All you have to do is set up a pole which is exactly straight up and down, normal to the ground, perpendicular, 90-degree angle to the ground. Well, watch the shadow, and at the moment that the shadow disappears because the sun is directly overhead, that is the moment of Chatzot. That is the moment of midday. Chatzot Halayla, the middle of the night, is exactly 12 hours after that. But Chatzot Halayla, the middle of the night, is not a simply observable phenomenon. Back in the days when they had no clocks, there was no simple way to know when exactly, when it is chatzot, exactly 12 hours after midday. There was no simple way to know that. And indeed, even today, if you don't have a clock, there's no simple way to know exactly when chatzot is. So those halachot, which depend upon hanetzach hama, chatzot hayom, shkia, we can be exquisitely precise in establishing the times. Other halachot, which depend upon chatzot halayla, midnight, or tzeit kochavim, the appearance of the stars, now we're getting into a little bit of a shaky area. Precision is not so simple in these cases. What have we learned so far? We've learned that Ma'ariv can be davened more or less when you want. There are no precise requirements here. Do it a little bit earlier, a little bit later. Kriya Shema must be after the appearance of the stars, and if you daven Ma'ariv, Arvit, before the appearance of the stars, then you're just going to have to repeat the 3 paragraphs of Shema Yisrael later in the evening. That's the Rambam, and that's the mainstream thinking of all of the poskim from the earliest times until the 17th century. We're not ready yet to get close to the 17th century. Let's take a look now at what it says in the Yerushalmi. I don't mention in the course of these classes the exact sources that I'm drawing the texts from, because you always have the exact source on the screen. So if you want to look up the exact source and see the context or see the typographical errors I made, you have the exact sources on the screen. Nachon. In my holy neighborhood, we daven shacharit in the morning exactly at sunrise, and only because we have a clock can the chazan, the shliach tzibur, time the pace of the brachot and kriya shema and so forth, so that we will come to the beginning of the Amidah, the beginning of the Shemona Esrei, exactly at the right time. Only because we have a clock can we do that. Now, it says like this in Yerushalmi. Amar Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi said, Ein korin kriyat shema shel Arvit b'veit HaKnesset b'shvil letzet yedei chovato. We always recite Shema Yisrael as part of the evening prayers in the synagogue, but that is not a fulfillment of the mitzvah. We do it every night, every evening. We always recite the 3 paragraphs of Shema in the synagogue as part of Ma'ariv, as part of Arvit, but that's not the mitzvah of Shema Yisrael. Ella, kedei la'amod b'tfilah, it should say, b'tfilah mitoch davar shel Torah. The reason we say Shema Yisrael before the Tefilah is because one should always have Divrei Torah before Tefilah. That's why Mincha is always preceded by Ashrei. That's why Musaf is always preceded by Ashrei. Some Divrei Torah are always called for before, prior to prayer. That's why we say Shema Yisrael before the prayer in Ma'ariv. It's not the mitzvah of Shema Yisrael because it's too early in the afternoon. It's not, the stars haven't appeared yet. But you'll notice that the Yerushalmi takes it for granted. The Yerushalmi just assumes that, of course, everyone is davening Ma'ariv before nightfall. That was the standard practice in every community in antiquity and through the Middle Ages. The reason it was the standard practice in every community throughout the Jewish world to have the evening prayers before nightfall was because they did not have artificial illumination in the streets. And when it was dark, it was dark. And people wanted to scurry home while there was still some light outside. Now, back in those days, uh, uh, when they did not have artificial illumination in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, life was a little bit different than we are accustomed to, where everything is brightly lit all 24 hours of the day. I'll give you a few examples, and you'll understand a little bit about how life was in those days. There's a historian by the name of Eckrich who recently published a book entitled "The Close of Day," a history of what people used to do at nighttime. He's a very good historian, and in the pre-industrial period, he goes up to the industrial period, how people occupied themselves. What did people do at night? And it turns out that people in different places and different times did different things. Very interesting, his history book, if you're interested in history. But among the things you will learn there is that back in those days, parents used to send their children outside to play during the daylight, and children would be taught a game which they would play in daylight, a game called Blind Man's Bluff. I remember playing this game when I was a little boy. I didn't think it was very amusing. I really didn't go for this game very much. But it was a game which our parents and grandparents taught the little children to play. The game works as follows. One contestant wears a blindfold and has to find things and identify things just by feeling. Now in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, this was more than a game. Back in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, before the days of artificial illumination, this was a vital element in raising children because children had to learn to memorize every step in their village. If someone had to set foot outside of his house, outside of her house, at night time in those days, well, certain days there might be a lot of moonlight, but many days it would be pitch black outside at night. If you had to go somewhere at night outside your house, you had to know every step of your village, exactly how many steps it is to the corner, exactly how many steps from here to there, so you won't fall into this pit, so you won't bump into that. Children had to memorize step by step everything in their village. The Gemara has a great praise of Shmuel, one of the great Babylonian rabbis. The Gemara praises Shmuel. The great Babylonian rabbi is saying he knew as much about the paths of the heavenly bodies, the celestial bodies. He knew as much about the orbits of the planets and the movements of the stars as he knew the streets in his village of Nahardoya. Well, of course, everyone knew exactly, step by step, the streets of their village, and he knew the paths of the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the planets, and so forth, equally well. Back in those days, this was very important, but of course, they had to get home before it was dark, if possible. Well, the Yerushalmi assumes, and it's a historical fact, that in all Jewish communities, Ma'ariv was before nightfall. In antiquity, through the Middle Ages. Well, let's look what Rashi has to say about this. Rashi, we're down to the 11th century. This is early Middle Ages, on the cusp of the High Middle Ages. Rashi in the 11th century says, Lama korim kriyat shema b'veit HaKnesset. Why do we say Shema Yisrael in the evening prayer in the synagogue? We're not fulfilling the mitzvah. It's not nighttime yet. Because we want some divrei Torah before the prayer. This is exactly what we learned in the Yerushalmi on the previous screen. Therefore, we must repeat Kriya Shema again when it gets dark. Well, you see, Rashi also just takes it for granted. Of course, everyone is davening. Of course, everyone is doing the evening prayer before it gets dark, and then they scurry home and in the privacy of their own home, they will repeat Kriya Shema when it really is dark. Let's take a look at another opinion here. Rashi is on the Ashkenaz side of things. Let's go to the other side of the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain and see what the great Sephardic authority, the Rajba from the High Middle Ages, what he has to say about this. You might think that it's only the Ashkenazim who were following the assumptions of the Yerushalmi. We'll presently see that it's the Sfaradim as well. Masha nahagu lekrot Kriya Shema ba'od yom, the fact that we recite Shema Yisrael as part of the evening prayer before nightfall, ein yotzim b'yedei chova, we do not fulfill our obligation of the mitzvah of saying Shema Yisrael. We do it, but it's not a fulfillment of the mitzvah. It's not nighttime yet. Lo nahagu kein mitchila ela kedei la'amod b'tefila mitoch divrei Torah. The only reason we say Shema Yisrael before nightfall is so that when we come to the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, the silent prayer, we will come to it from Divrei Torah. Well, it's not only the Ashkenazim, the Sfaradim also are following the practice outlined in the Yerushalmi. Why do we make Braghot? Good question. If we were discussing the mitzvah of Kriya Shema, we would learn that the Braghot before and after are because sometimes, and we're going to see certain situations where people actually did fulfill the mitzvah of Kriya Shema at its proper time at night, and then the Braghot apply, and we would further see, if we were studying the mitzvah of Kriya Shema, we would see that there are some lenient opinions according to which one can indeed fulfill the mitzvah before nightfall. And the reason there are the reason these lenient opinions exist, not very many, but the reason they exist is exactly because we see that Chazal, the Anshe Knesset Agadola, instituted those brachot. So, in any event, both among the Ashkenaz communities and among the Sephardi communities in the Middle Ages, it was a davar pashut, obvious. Everyone knew you pray Ma'ariv while it's still light outside. לפי שאילו לא היו מתפללים תפילת הערב בבית כנסת, היה כל אחד הולך לביתו ולא היו מתפללים בציבור. The reason that we do Shema Yisrael and the Tefilah before nightfall is just to make sure that everyone davens. If they would do mincha in the shul and everyone would go home with the instruction that everyone should daven Ma'ariv privately at home, a lot of people would forget. It just wouldn't happen. While you have the people together, you do the mitzvah. And since the mitzvah of Ma'ariv, the Tefilah, the prayer of Ma'ariv, does not have a precise time, you can fulfill the mitzvah of Tefilah before dark. So once you have the people to do it, once you have the people together in the Beit Knesset, don't let them go until the mitzvah is done, or else it's going to get forgotten. It would be Torah, it would be a great burden on the people to reassemble them at nighttime. They would have to get their torches out, they would have to get their lanterns, which in those days were very expensive. A lot of people couldn't even afford them. It would have been a great burden upon the people to reassemble them at night. The burden would be so great that we can't entertain calling them all back for Ma'ariv after night. That's why we don't do it. And the fact is, you can fulfill the mitzvah of Tefilah before nighttime. Shema, everyone's going to have to remember to repeat at home. There's no solution to that problem. People would sometimes forget to daven Ma'ariv if they didn't do it while everyone is together. Lo hayu mitpalalim klal, they would end up not davening at all. And that's no good. Lefichach, therefore, mishum torach hatzibur hitir letpalel tfilas ariv mebod yom. in order not to impose this great burden on the synagogue, in order not to impose any great burden on the congregation, a burden which they wouldn't be able to fulfill in practice, because the people wouldn't leave their homes to come back to the synagogue at night time. Instead of this impractical burden, fulfill the mitzvah of Tefilah before nighttime, and Shema, let's hope for the best. Let's hope that the people will remember to repeat it at home individually at night. The only reason we recite Shema Yisrael before the Tefilah is so that the Tefilah should come from Divrei Torah, be preceded by Divrei Torah, and everyone is in the habit of repeating Shema Yisrael before they go to sleep, Kriyat Shema al Hamitah, and since everyone should be in the habit of doing that, that mitzvah is going to get done b'shas shchiva when they are ready to go to sleep. I know that nowadays, since the 17th century, since the introduction of the clock, when most people are indeed davening Ma'ariv later at night, so you don't have to say all the 3 paragraphs of Shema Yisrael, Al Hamitah, before going to sleep, because you really did the mitzvah earlier. But if you're still davening in the old style, where Ma'ariv is before nightfall, and this is particularly common for Kabbalat Shabbat and Ma'ariv on Friday afternoon in the summer, where many communities have the prayers before nightfall on Friday afternoon, before Friday night. Then, of course, the 3 paragraphs of Shema will be required later at night. The Rashba falls in line with the Ashkenaz thinkers. Every community was davening Ma'ariv before nightfall. And he adds, V'chein katav Rashi v'Aravid, Rav Yitzchak ibn Gayat, Harbei min ha'Gaonim. The Rashba says, this is what Rashi said, this is what I say, this is what everyone says. That was the standard practice. Well, as you probably know, there still are some communities which are davening Ma'ariv before sunset, and we'll come to the modern situation eventually. Let's go one step further. I want to look now at the Ra'avan. The Ra'avan was in France, southern France. It was in Germany in the 12th century, in the High Middle Ages. I realize that when I say that the Ra'avan lived in Germany, I understand that this is a little bit of a historical anachronism. Of course, there was no place called Germany in the 12th century. But when I say he's from Germany, I mean he's from the place which later was going to be called Germany. Same thing if I say someone is from France. Of course, there was no France back in those days. I mean, he's from the area which later was going to be called France. These are the words of the Ra'avan. Tiknu hitpalel v'lekro kriyat shema ba'od yom. They instructed us, they instituted and instructed us. The rabbis told us we should daven Ma'ariv and kriyat shema ba'od yom before nightfall. That's not just something everyone does. It's something we were told to do. That is what the Gemara instructs us to do, and we saw the passage in the Yerushalmi. That's what you're supposed to do. Kriyat Shema and prayer, Miba'od Yom, while it is still daylight outside. And the reason was because people ate their evening meal when it was still daylight in the summer. Now think about it for a moment. Back in those days, in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, 2 meals a day was the standard. On Shabbat, a 3rd meal. But during weekdays, 2 meals was the standard, a morning meal and an evening meal. And those meals were typically separated by around 6 hours or so. And in the summer, when sunset is very late, the evening meal would be while it was still daylight. In the winter, of course, the evening meal would be at home when it was dark outside. But since in the summer they were eating their evening meal before nightfall, and lo yachol le'echol el b'kriyas Shema, and one is not allowed to eat. One is not allowed to eat a meal until you have fulfilled the requisite mitzvahs. For example, on Rosh Hashanah, when you have to blow the shofar, you can't eat a meal before doing the mitzvah of shofar. Even if you're stuck at home in bed and you can't go to shul and you're waiting for someone to come and bring a shofar to your house to blow the shofar for you privately, that person has to arrive before you eat your meal. If you're going to read the Megillah at night on Purim, or you're going to light Hanukkah candles on Hanukkah, you have to do the mitzvah of the time before eating. Chazal were afraid that if you start eating first, well, you might never get around to doing the mitzvah. So mitzvahs have to be done before eating. And since they were eating while it was still daylight, well, Chazal said, you have to do Shema and Tefilah first. And that means Shema and Tefilah during daylight. You'll notice in passing that the Ravan is one of those poskim who seems to imply, doesn't say flat out, but seems to imply that there's some fulfillment of the mitzvah of Kriyas Shema even before nightfall. I mentioned before that there are such views, but they're not very strongly held, and he doesn't actually say it, but it seems to be implied by what he says. And since during the summer people had no choice but to daven, say Kriyas Shema and daven before the evening meal, which would be at home before it got dark, well, for consistency, they just did the same thing all year long. But it began back in the days when sunset was late. Sunset was late in the summertime. But again, the Ra'avan in Germany just assumes that, of course, everyone is reciting Shema and davening before nightfall. The only question is why, and he has his explanation. Let's go a little bit further in time, down to the 13th century. The Ra'avya says as follows: Nahagu mimot Rabbeinu Harishonim. Since the days of the Rishonim, what we call the Ra'avya a Rishon. When we say Rishon, we mean the great rabbis of the Middle Ages. But the great rabbis of the Middle Ages, when they said a Rishon, they meant the rabbis of the Gemara. Since the days of the great rabbis of the Gemara, Nahagu, it has been the practice, Shemit Palalim Ba'artzenu, that we pray in our country, Mincha v'Ma'ariv b'yachad, Mincha and Ma'ariv together. And indeed, so close together that they didn't even say Aleinu l'shabeach after Mincha. After the repetition of the Shmona Esrei and Mincha, they just flashed straight into Baruch Hu and Ma'ariv, and the single Aleinu l'shabeach after Ma'ariv, that did duty for both Mincha and Ma'ariv. That's the way they're doing it. Yachad. Absolutely no break, no intermission, no interruption at all between Mincha and Ma'ariv, and there still are a few communities here and there which do it that way. Mincha, after the repetition of the Shemona Esrei, straight, immediately, without the slightest interruption, into Baruch Hu and Kriyat Shema and Tefilah for the night. That's the way they were doing it then in every Jewish community. And that was standard accepted practice in antiquity and the Middle Ages. Kohen Kriyat Shema ba'od yom, and in every community in our country, he wrote this in Germany in the 13th century, we're all davening Ma'ariv early. Early means before nightfall. Well, this is all very interesting, isn't it? Let's go one step further. Coming closer to modern times, we're going to look now at the Darchei Moshe. Darchei Moshe was written by Rav Moshe Isserles. Rav Moshe Isserles, usually just called the Ramah, Reish Mem Aleph, Rav Moshe Isserles, the Ramah. The Ramah is a particularly important source because he added the Ashkenaz notes to the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch has a Sfaradi author, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and of course, many of the opinions reflected in the Shulchan Aruch are the opinions of the great Sephardic authorities. In those places where the Ashkenaz authorities disagree with the Sfaradim, the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, added his Ashkenaz notes. Before he added his notes to the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote the Sefer that we're about to quote from now, the Darchei Moshe. He wrote the Darchei Moshe as a commentary on the Torah, and in this commentary on the Torah, he expounds the Ashkenaz way of understanding different halachot. In this Sefer, he presents the Ashkenaz position on different halachot, and later, when he added those notes to the Shulchan Aruch, the notes of the Shulchan Aruch are just a distillation, a bottom line of what he wrote in the Darchei Moshe. If you encounter a passage in the Ramah, in his notes on the Shulchan Aruch, which is unclear to you and not clear exactly what he means, the first place to look for more explanation is in the Darchei Moshe, where you will almost always find exactly the same idea expressed in far more detail with sources and explanations. Okay, let's see what the Darchei Moshe has to say about our issue. Correct, not only the Yemenites, but the others as well. Darchei Moshe wrote this in the beginning of the 16th century. So we're getting closer and closer to modern times. He quotes the Agur from 15th century Germany. Koret tigara minhag shelanu shekarim lif'amim bimei kayetz shtayim o shalosh sha'ot kodem tzeit kochavim. The Sefer HaAgur, written in Germany back in the 15th century, is Korei Tigar. That means he's angry with, he fights against the minhag, against the practice of certain communities in Germany in those days, which were reciting Shema and the evening prayer 2 or 3 hours before nighttime. That, he said, is too early. That's too early. We don't wait until nightfall, but at least wait till close to nightfall. 2 or 3 hours before night, that's really too early, the Agur wrote. Katav, v'zeh leshono. Now he quotes the Agur. Kvar nish'ala she'ela zo le'maharik. This question was already asked of the Maharik in Italy. The Maharik, in the 15th century in Germany, they already discussed this question. The Katvu and the earlier rabbis back in the 15th century already wrote, Deloch matz'u ta'am v'semech l'minhag. 2 or 3 hours before nightfall is too early, and the people should not daven that early. Before night is fine, but at least closer to night. Now if they say that 2 or 3 hours is too early, this implies, not very strongly, but mildly implies that at 1 hour before nightfall, that's okay. 1 hour before nightfall for Shema Yisrael and the Tefilah. That's okay for Ma'ariv. But 2 or 3 hours, that's too much. Maharik v'harbei ba'alei nefesh lo hayu mitpalim arvitim etzibur. And for this reason, some rabbis refrained from davening together with their congregations. The rabbi of the synagogue, sitting up front in the synagogue, they daven mincha. It's 2 or 3 hours before nightfall, and the rabbi is not happy with his flock davening so early in the afternoon. That's what they're doing. He just sits there quietly while they're davening Ma'ariv, and he's going to daven Ma'ariv later by himself. Alayla. He would daven later at home privately. Now let's think for a moment about this practice of the Maharik and the other rabbis of the 15th century who were unhappy with the people davening so early. Apparently, they were unable to change the practice of the people. These were the leading rabbis of the generation. They had their synagogues, they had their flocks. Something went wrong here, I think. No, we're still okay. The rabbis thought what the people were doing. The rabbis thought that what the people in the community are doing, what the people in their community are doing, is wrong, but they were apparently powerless to stop the people. They were apparently powerless to change the practice in their own synagogues, so they just sat there quietly, tolerated it, and then would daven privately at home. And since the rabbi was giving up public prayer, of course, Tefilah b'tzibur. So let's get that typed correctly on chat. Tefilah b'tzibur, public prayer, is of course always far superior to private prayer. As the Gemara says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God always responds to public prayer. Of course, one should always join with the minyan. One should always join with the community in prayer. Of course, that tefillah is far superior. But these rabbis said 2 or 3 hours before nightfall is too early. I prefer to daven in private. And since he's not going to have a minyan at all, since he's going to be in private, so he can do it at home, or he doesn't have to leave his house. And since he doesn't have to leave his house, so he'll lose the merit, he'll lose the benefit of public prayer, Tefilah b'tzibur, but at least he'll daven at night. Now you'll notice that this is a little revolutionary. Revolutionary in the sense that the rabbi wants to overturn the practice of the people. He wants a little revolution here. He wants the practice of the community to change, but he's powerless to do it. Since he is unable to bring his revolution to fruition, since he's unable to actually change the practice of the people, at least his own private practice he can change, even though he's losing the benefit of Tefilah b'tzibur. But we notice in passing that that's what they were doing. It was the standard practice to daven Ma'ariv while it was still full daylight, even 2 or 3 hours before sunset. V'chein ani hakatan noheg b'zman hakayetz, and that's what I do during the summer. The Agur writes, he was the rabbi of his community, and in the synagogue every afternoon, 2 or 3 hours before nightfall, they would daven mincha together, and he would, of course, daven mincha together with the tzibur, together with the community. And then when they flashed into Ma'ariv, he would just sit there or stand there quietly, smile tolerantly. He was unhappy with what his flock was doing, but there's nothing he could do to correct them. They wouldn't change their ways. And at night, he would daven privately at home when it was already after nightfall. Those are the words of the Agur, as quoted by the Darchei Moshe in his notes on the tour. כתב המעריד, יש מקומות שמקדימים להתפלל 3 או 4 שעות קודם הלילה. Back then, there were communities which were davening not 2 or 3 hours before nightfall, but 3 or 4 hours before nightfall. והמנהג נשתרבב על ידי תשות כוח. And the reason this practice began, and the rabbis were unhappy with it being so early in the afternoon. The reason that the minhag the reason this practice began was because of teshut koach. People were weak. They'd worked the whole day very hard. They were tired at the end of the day. We're getting to be 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock. No, there are places in Europe where the sun doesn't set until 10:30, 11 o'clock in the summer. The people are tired. They want to go home and have their evening meal and fall into bed. They worked hard the whole day. They don't want to wait until 11:30 to go to sleep. They were tired. Te'evim, they were hungry. Tzme'im, they were thirsty. After all, it's been a long time since the morning meal, and they ate typically 2 meals a day. They wanted to eat and drink. V'ba'od hayom gadol. True, it wasn't night yet. True, it was still 3 or 4 hours until night, but it's been a long time since the morning meal because the days are so long in Northern Europe. Mishum kach hikdimu l'hitpalel le'echol miyad achar kach. So they would daven mincha, ma'ariv together with mincha, and then while it was still 2, 3, 4 hours of daylight, they would go home, eat the evening meal, and go to sleep. And again, if you're interested in a historical analysis of exactly how this was happening in different communities, Eckrich, in his book on the history of night practices, does not deal with rabbinic sources. It does not deal with Jewish communities at all. But at least you can see there what was going on among the non-Jewish communities. Afilu Talmid Chacham lo yifrosh atzmo min hatzibur. One should never separate oneself from the community. Of course, you should pray together with the community. Of course, that's better. HaKadosh Baruch Hu always responds to the community prayer. And of course, there's a prohibition to separate yourself from the community. It says in Pirkei Avot, Al tifrosh min hatzibur. You're not allowed to separate yourself from the community, even though you're a Talmid Chacham, even though you are a great rabbinic scholar and you think what they're doing is wrong. You should still not abandon the community. Im lo yuchal limchot bahem. If you cannot correct their ways, if the people are still going to continue doing what they're doing, shalom l'chakdim kol kach, you cannot correct their ways. They're davening too early, 4 hours before night time, ma'ariv, 4 hours before night. Elim kein hurgal b'shah precious. Well, you should daven with them. You should pray ma'ariv with them, even though it's so early, unless you are a great rabbinic scholar who in every other issue is very strict. If you are very strict in every other issue in Torah, then you can be strict in this one too and daven ma'ariv privately at home. But this idea of separating yourself from the congregation and davening separately from them, this is acceptable only if you are a great tzaddik who is very, very strict in every issue in Torah. But if you're an ordinary citizen, no. You should daven with the people, even though it is so early. Az yitpalel gam ken b'layla, you pray at night only if you're a great tzaddik who is well known to the community as being extraordinarily strict in every area. After all, the great tzaddik who is very strict in every Torah issue, well, the members of the community know him. They know that's the way he is, and therefore They do not consider him separating himself from the public prayer as being a rebellion against the public prayer. They understand that's the way he is. He's very strict in everything, so the community can be tolerant of his separating himself from the community and davening privately. That's only for a small number of great tzaddikim. Bottom line, the Ramah falls, bottom line, the Ramah falls in line with all the other sources of evidence. They were, in fact, davening Mincha and Ma'ariv together very early in the afternoon. Some rabbis were unhappy about how early it was, and some rabbis were so unhappy about how early it was that they would daven privately, Ma'ariv at home after night. But even those rabbis were unable to have any influence over their communities, were unable to change the practice of the communities. That's what we learn from the Agur and all of the rabbis he quotes. The Mordechai tells the same story all over again, and this is therefore historically well established. Let's go one point further. We're coming now onto the cusp of modern times, the Shalom HaKodesh. The Shalom HaKodesh, Shalosh Shin Lamed Hey, Shnei Luchot Habrit is the full name of the book. Let's get that typed on chat. Shnei Luchot Habrit. Of course, in the yeshiva world, if you tell someone that you know the opinion as expressed in the Shnei Luchot Habrit, a lot of people won't grasp exactly what you're talking about. Everyone calls it the Shalom by the initials, by the Rashi Tevot. The Shalom was written by Rabbi Yeshaya Horowitz. He was from Germany, 17th century, and he came here to Yerushalayim. He lived at the end of his life. He lived here in Yerushalayim. He was immensely influential, both in the world of halacha and in the world of Kabbalah. He was both a great mystic and a great posek, one of the few great personalities who combined great achievement in both fields, Jewish mysticism and in halacha. When he eventually came to Eretz Yisrael, when he came to Yerushalayim, he wrote as follows. B'chutz la'aretz, outside of Israel, he remembered the way life was in Germany in the 17th century. But Medina, Poland, Beam, in Poland, in Eastern Germany. Beam is what we call today the Czech Republic. Bohemia was the old name for it, right? Kol Malchut, the Ashkenaz, and the areas which are today called Germany, the whole of the Ashkenaz sphere, that's what he was familiar with. Noagim Litpalel Arvit Hen Od Hayom Gadol. We're into the 17th century here, and in every Jewish community, they were still davening Ma'ariv while it was still daylight before nightfall. B'kol makom chadashim mikarov ba'u. But now, in the 17th century, there starts to be more rebels. Now, in the 17th century, things begin to change. Chadashim, mikarov ba'u, innovators from nearby, innovators from our own community, innovators are arising in our own community who are beginning to change things. In the 17th century, some people began to change the standard practice. V'yesh chavrusa kadesha, and there's a holy group, a certain number of people, 10 or more, a certain number of people in the community stand up and want to improve their Jewish practice. They want to do things better. And what does this small group of people do, 10 or more? They separate themselves from the main community. Mitchabrim, they join together. Litpalel arvit b'sha'ato. They join together to daven Ma'ariv at night. K'moshe ra'iti, I saw this with my own eyes, Bishalom writes, Be'ir ve'em be'Yisrael be'Prague, in the great Jewish city of Prague. Prague was one of the major centers of Jewish learning in the 17th century. I saw this myself. There was a small group of people who did not daven Ma'ariv together with the congregation before nightfall, but they joined together to daven Ma'ariv after the appearance of the stars. This is, historically speaking, the first breakaway minyan in Jewish history. Up till this point, every Jewish community, everywhere in the world, did everything in lockstep uniformity. The minhag, the practice of every community, everywhere in the Jewish world was absolutely uniform. Everyone had exactly the same minhagim. Even in a large Jewish town, up till this time, prior to the 17th century, even in a large Jewish town like Prague with many synagogues, every synagogue had exactly the same minhagim. They would pray at the same time, with exactly the same text, with exactly the same melodies. There was no variation of minhagim within a town prior to the 17th century. What we are now looking at is the first evidence in Jewish history of a breakaway minyan, small number of people who say, we want to do things better than the community does, and we are going to reassemble. After nightfall, we are going to reassemble after the appearance of the stars in the synagogue to daven Ma'ariv. It just happens that, historically speaking, this change occurs simultaneously with the introduction of household clocks. Now, the first household clock, which was marketed in the early 17th century, was the water clock. Water clock is just a cylinder of glass with a hole at the bottom, drip, 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 drip. As the water drips out from the cylinder, the water level goes down. There are markings on the side of the cylinder, so people can tell what time it is just by looking at the water clock. That was the first commercial clock, which was introduced in the 17th century at this time, and people had them, in their homes. Visit museums and see examples of them. Now, the water clocks which they had were not terribly precise. If you think about it for a moment, the speed at which the water drips out of the cylinder depends on a number of factors. It depends upon air pressure, which changes from day to day. It depends upon the size of the hole in the bottom of the water clock, and the hole expands and contracts with temperature. On warmer days, the hole is a little bit bigger. On colder days, the hole is a little bit smaller. These water clocks were not very accurate. And indeed, the examples of these water clocks, which exist in museums today, are accurate to within around an hour a day or so. But for the first time in history, people had clocks at home. Having a clock at home made it possible to make an announcement. Those who wish to reassemble in the synagogue for the evening prayer after the appearance of the stars, kindly come at 9:30 at night. And people would know when to come because they had clocks at home. The existence of the household clock made it possible for the first breakaway minyan to be established. And that is what we are seeing here. Okay, at this point, we're right at the cusp of history. This is the point at which the old ways ended and the new ways began. And it's the introduction of, in those days, the water clock, which spurred the innovation, the change in Jewish practice. we're going to pause at this time. I'm going to wish you a good week and eventually a Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you all again next week when we will see the vast ramifications. This is just the beginning of the mushrooming, the snowballing. We'll see what happens after this as a result of this development. Eckridge, send me an email. I'll send you bibliographic information. Till then, shalom, shalom.